Duncan versus Bonta, the big lawsuit involving California's ban on so-called large capacity magazines, which are really just standard capacity magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. Anyway, I actually read California's brief, and there's a lot of nonsense in there. I'm going to talk about some of them. First of all, I want to talk about what I consider the biggest one when we get back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, constitutional attorney, and New York Times bestselling author. If you haven't subscribed to the Four Boxes Diner Second Amendment channel, please do so. We're desperately trying to get to 100,000 subscribers. It'll make a big deal to us in terms of the algorithm and spreading the word. All right, folks, so I actually read the state of California's brief in Duncan versus Bonta, which is the lawsuit involving the so-called large capacity magazine ban out of California. And there's a whole lot of hooey in that California brief, but I just want to talk about one of them right here and right now with this particular video. Specifically, California argues that one of their excuses and justifications under the law for being able to ban standard capacity magazines that holds more than 10 rounds, while simultaneously, by the way, allowing law enforcement and retired law enforcement to keep them. Why is that? Maybe because there's a defensive purpose and they're arms, but set that issue aside. Why does California argue? Well, they have a whole bunch of arguments, but one of their big arguments is that this mass killings, these mass shootings that we've seen recently is an unknown social problem that did not exist in 1791 or during the founding period, that violence among humans is apparently a shocking new development. And these so-called, according they write, mass shootings is a new social phenomenon that justifies them justifies them being able to ignore the text, the history, and the tradition of the right to keep and bear arms in America. This is a whole bunch of nonsense. Here's why the argument that the founding fathers were unfamiliar with mass killings. That's what we're talking about here, mass killings. Not just mass shootings, but mass killings. The massive loss of life in a short period of time due to violence. Well, we know what the founding fathers did ultimately. They wrote the Second Amendment that actually preserved the right to keep and bear arms. But were the founding fathers familiar with mass shootings and mass killings? Were the founding fathers familiar with violence at the time of the founding that would cause them to actually create and memorialize the Second Amendment, which memorialized the right to keep and bear arms, a pre-existing right? Let's go to the historical record, why don't we? Let's go to something super difficult, something that I'm sure that no one in California on the left has ever heard about because they probably don't really read history anymore, at least the history of heroic America. Let's start with the most basic history in American life, the Boston Massacre. That's right, the Boston Massacre. Do you think that's relevant to the founding of our country? Well, the Boston Massacre took place in the city of Boston. I believe at this time it was the second largest city in the country, behind, I think, just Philadelphia. But it was one of the largest cities in America at the time. And guess what happened? At the Boston Massacre, well, you know the story, British soldiers opened fire and killed with guns 5 Americans. And they shot and wounded 6 other Americans. So here you have it, literally at the start of the American Revolution, literally at the point in time of our founding that gives rise to the Declaration of Independence and gives rise to our country and the Constitution and the Second Amendment. You literally have a mass shooting in Boston of 11 Americans, 5 of whom died, 6 of whom are wounded with gunshots. And what did our founding fathers do? Did they say, let's ban guns in Boston, let's ban guns in America? No, they go the absolute opposite direction. They actually ensure that Americans have firearms to be able to protect themselves against various forms of violence. And this is not a shock, because it wasn't just the Boston Massacre mass shooting of 11 people at the time of the founding that they were aware of. It was also they knew their history. They knew their history in America, and they knew their history around the world. Let me start with the history around the world, and then I'm going to focus in on some other examples of mass killings that the Founding Fathers were well aware of. First of all, I have written a major article. You're familiar with this. Many of you have probably read it in the Pepperdine Law Review. I wrote an article a couple years ago on the importance of an Italian Enlightenment philosopher, Cesare Beccaria. Now, Cesare Beccaria is a name you may not be familiar with, but you should. And if you studied history, you would know this guy in early American history. Even though Cesare Beccaria was an Italian, his writings were world famous. And what did he write about? He wrote about criminology. So Cesare Beccaria wrote about criminology, the study of crime and whatnot. He was very important. I'll tell you how important he was to the Founding Fathers. His writings, and I'm going to give you the writing that was written down by none other than Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, and John Adams. Both Adams and Jefferson literally wrote what I'm about to read. That's how important it was. And Beccaria was on the list of things to read, I believe, at the Constitutional Convention. So he's a big deal. Now, what Beccaria wrote is going to sound, believe it or not, like a 21st century NRA slogan if you buy into the anti-gun rhetoric. You know that if you ban guns, only outlaws will have guns. You know that slogan? That's not an NRA slogan. That's not a 21st century slogan. That's not a 20th century slogan. That is a slogan that comes from Cesare Beccaria at the time of America's founding when he wrote his book. Here's what Beccaria wrote, and this is the exact passage. I'm only going to read you part of it. It's a long passage, powerful passage, but both Jefferson and Adams both wrote this down from Cesare Beccaria. Here's what Beccaria wrote at the time of our founding about gun control. Beccaria writes that the laws that forbid the carrying of arms are laws of such a nature, referring to you sacrifice a lot just to get a little back. That's what he's talking about. The laws that forbid the carrying of arms are laws of such a nature. They disarm those only who are neither inclined nor determined to commit crimes. Did you hear what I just said? From the founding period of America, before the Second Amendment was written, I'm going to quote, and Adams and Jefferson literally wrote this down in their hands from Cesare Beccaria's book. Beccaria writes, quote, they disarm, talking about gun control laws, they disarm those only who are neither inclined nor determined to commit crimes. They disarm, again, they disarm the law-abiding Americans. They disarm the law-abiding citizen. Beccaria knew this in the 18th century. We know it today in the 21st. Beccaria goes on. Again, Adams and Jefferson wrote this down in their handwriting in their common books. They wrote it down. Here's what else Beccaria wrote. Such laws, referring to gun control laws, arms control laws, okay? Such laws make things worse for the assaulted and better for the assailants. They serve rather to encourage than to prevent homicides. For an unarmed man may be attacked with greater confidence than an armed man. Close quote. Cesare Beccaria. Again, such laws, gun control laws, make things worse for the assaulted and better for the assailants. They serve rather to encourage than to prevent homicides, for an unarmed man may be attacked with greater confidence than an armed man. Close quote. That's Cesare Beccaria. That line from his book was written down by Thomas Jefferson and John Adams at the time of our founding. The same time that they were familiar with the mass shooting of the Boston Massacre, where 11 people are shot, 5 of whom are killed. But that wasn't again, it's not about the system. Remember, let's put this into context. California is arguing that they get to ban so-called magazines or large capacity magazines because of social issues that occur today, mass shootings that didn't occur at the time of the founding. Of course, mass shooting is just a metaphor for violence, which has been with us since Cain and Abel, right? It's not exactly new. Humans have been killing people long before there was even guns on the planet. But set that issue aside. But now, I've just talked to you about international. I've talked to you about the Boston Massacre. Let me just give you a quick list of all the other mass killings that occurred during the founding or before the founding that our founding fathers were familiar with. And what did the founding fathers do? They embraced an armed citizenry. They didn't embrace gun control. They didn't. They instead encouraged an armed citizenry. So the fact that California in Duncan versus Bonta is saying they could do all this crazy gun control law and ban magazines in the name of a social problem that didn't exist at the time of the founding is BS. I've already proven it's BS, but let me continue. In 1622 in Jamestown, 347 men, women, and children were killed by Indians. Killed by Indians in a single day. In 1755, Draper's Meadow Massacre took place when Shawnee Indians killed how many? 5 people. 5 people in a raid. In 1755, the Penn Creek Massacre, guess what? 14 people killed. Penn Creek Massacre along the river there in Pennsylvania, I believe. 1774, 2 years before the Declaration of Independence. North American tribes attacked all sorts of Virginia villages and Virginia settlements. They did, to the point where James Madison wrote about the topic and John Adams wrote about the topic and then said that Americans are starting to carry guns throughout the area, all in anticipation of being attacked by Indians. Now, by the way, the Supreme Court is aware of Indian attacks, and the best example of this is the following. During the oral argument in Heller in 2008, that's when this case was decided, none other than Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy specifically asked the lawyer for the government, for Washington, D.C., whether or not, and he basically says, didn't the founding fathers and the colonists at the time of our founding, didn't they need firearms for protection against criminals, outlaws, bears, grizzlies, wolves, Indians, and things like that? That was Justice Kennedy's question at oral argument in Heller about the founding era. And again, put this into context. When the founding fathers knew about Cesare Beccaria's work, when the founding fathers knew about the Boston Massacre with 11 people shot in a mass shooting that helped spawn the American Revolution, when the founding fathers knew about all of these different Indian attacks to the point where a Supreme Court justice is asking about Indian attacks in 2008, well, guess what? What did they do? We embraced an armed citizenry. We didn't embrace magazine control, gun regulations, or tomahawk regulations. We didn't even ban tomahawks, right? We didn't do anything like this. So when California in Duncan versus Bonta tries to excuse their unconstitutional behavior of banning so-called large capacity magazines in the name of, here's the quote, unprecedented social concerns. Quote, unprecedented social concerns, i.e. mass shootings, that is simply not historically accurate. Founding fathers were well aware of mass violence at the time of the founding and before the founding, and they were aware of all sorts of things associated with it, including philosophers who wrote about it and criminologists who wrote about it. And what was the founding fathers' response to the dangers of violence? Not gun control, not disarmament, not gun confiscation, not gun bans. No, just the reverse. Our founding fathers embraced an armed citizenry in the right of the people to keep and bear arms. Memorialize that right with our Second Amendment. Okay, hope you learned a little bit something today. We're going to continue talking about some of these California arguments in Duncan versus Bonta and why they're wrong. And again, if you haven't subscribed, please do so. We really would appreciate it. And we'll see you again soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.